Tom Reynolds never imagined he'd have to fight another battle after returning from Afghanistan, but here he was, staring at an HOA notice declaring his $200,000 worth of farm equipment would be auctioned off in 48 hours. The notice was as fraudulent as it was shocking. He didn't even belong to their association. As a third-generation farmer and disabled veteran who had given everything for his country, he was about to give them a lesson in real American justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Reynolds family farm, a sprawling 120-acre haven that had been Tom's anchor since returning from his final tour in 2019. The property, nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, was more than just land. It was his therapy, his purpose, and his family's legacy. 3 generations of Reynolds had worked this soil, transforming it from rocky terrain into some of the most productive farmland in Butler County. Tom had inherited the farm from his father, James Reynolds, who passed away while Tom was serving his second tour. The news had hit him hard overseas, but knowing he had this land to come home to kept him going through the darkest days. The farm wasn't just about growing crops, it was about healing. After losing his left leg below the knee to an IED, Tom had found solace in adapting his father's old tractors with hand controls and specialized equipment. Each piece of machinery on his farm told a story of resilience and adaptation. His prized possession was a restored 1976 John Deere 4430, the same tractor he'd learned to drive on as a kid. His father had taught him every spring how to prep it for planting season, and now Tom had modified it with custom controls that allowed him to work the land despite his prosthetic. The collection of equipment he'd carefully assembled over the years, the combine harvester, the specialized planting machinery, the irrigation systems, represented not just monetary investment, but years of carefully adapting each piece to accommodate his disability. The farm itself was a patchwork of wheat fields, corn rows, and his latest project, a 5-acre vegetable garden where he taught other disabled veterans basic farming skills. Soldiers to Soil, he called it, a program he'd started 2 years ago that was already helping dozens of vets find their footing in civilian life. The old barn, its red paint weathered but proud, housed not just his equipment but also served as a gathering place for his veteran support group. Living on the outskirts of the growing suburban sprawl of Butler County, Tom had watched with unease as development crept closer to his property line. New housing developments had sprung up like mushrooms after rain, bringing with them pristine lawns, cookie-cutter houses, and most concerning, an aggressive homeowners association that seemed to think its jurisdiction extended beyond its actual boundaries. The Oakwood Hills HOA, led by a former real estate developer named Victoria Pierce, had been eyeing the area around Tom's farm for months. They'd already pressured 2 other small farmers to sell, turning generations-old family lands into manicured subdivisions with names like Farmstead Estates. A cruel irony that wasn't lost on Tom, but Tom Reynolds wasn't about to become another casualty of suburban expansion. The same determination that had gotten him through 15 months of rehabilitation and physical therapy after his injury now steeled him for the fight ahead. As he sat at his kitchen table that morning, sunlight streaming through windows that had witnessed nearly a century of Reynolds family history, he read the HOA's notice again. His jaw clenched tight. The document claimed he was in violation of multiple HOA bylaws regarding agricultural equipment storage and commercial farming activities. It stated that unless he paid $47,000 in accumulated fines by Friday, his equipment would be seized and auctioned. The absurdity of it might have made him laugh if the threat weren't so real. He wasn't even part of their HOA, had never signed any agreement with them, and his property predated their development by nearly 80 years. Tom took a slow sip of his coffee, his father's old Marine Corps mug warm in his hands. He'd faced down insurgents in Kandahar province. He wasn't about to be intimidated by an overzealous HOA board with delusions of grandeur. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. Reaching for his phone, Tom made 2 calls. The first was to Sarah Chen, a fierce local attorney who specialized in property rights and had a particular distaste for HOA overreach. The second was to his old squad leader, Mike Torres, who now ran a successful social media consulting firm. If the HOA wanted a war, he'd give them one, both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. The battle for Reynolds Family Farm was about to begin, and Tom was fighting for more than just his equipment. He was fighting for every family farmer who'd ever been bullied by developers, for every veteran who'd found purpose in working the land, and for a way of life that was worth protecting. The distant rumble of engines broke through the early morning quiet of Reynolds Family Farm. Tom, already awake and nursing his second cup of coffee on the front porch, felt his combat-trained instincts kick in before his mind fully registered what he was hearing. The sound was too heavy, too mechanical for normal farm equipment, and it was coming from his north access road. He reached for his cane. The humidity always made his prosthetic leg ache more in the mornings, and made his way down the porch steps. The familiar weight of his father's Marine Corps dog tags pressed against his chest beneath his shirt, a constant reminder of the legacy he carried. As he rounded the corner of his equipment barn, the source of the noise became clear, and his blood ran cold. A convoy of vehicles was making its way down his private road. 2 large tow trucks, a flatbed trailer, and several SUVs with the Oakwood Hills HOA logo emblazoned on their sides. Leading the procession was a sleek black Mercedes, which Tom recognized as belonging to Victoria Pierce, the HOA president. They weren't waiting for Friday's deadline. They were coming for his equipment now. Tom's hand tightened around his cane as he pulled out his phone, quickly starting to record video. Years of military training had taught him the value of documenting everything, and something told him this footage would be important. The vehicles came to a stop near his main equipment barn, kicking up clouds of dust that caught the early morning sunlight. Victoria Pierce emerged from her Mercedes first, immaculately dressed in a designer suit that looked comically out of place. On a farm, behind her, men in uniforms bearing the logo of Superior Asset Recovery began to fan out, heading toward the barn where Tom kept most of his equipment. The same barn where, just yesterday, he'd taught 2 young veterans how to maintain a tractor engine as part of his rehabilitation program. "Mr. Reynolds!" Victoria called out, her voice carrying a false sweetness that set Tom's teeth on edge. "I see you're up early. That makes this easier." She held up a document in a clear plastic sleeve. "We have authorization to seize and remove equipment in lieu of unpaid fines and violations." Tom kept his phone recording as he approached, his military bearing evident in his straight posture despite his cane. "The only thing you have, Ms. Pierce, is about 30 seconds to get your people off my private property before I call the sheriff." His voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. Victoria's practiced smile didn't waver. "The sheriff's department has already been notified of our enforcement action. We have the legal right to—" "You have no rights here," Tom cut her off, his voice sharp. "This property isn't part of your HOA. Never has been, never will be. Those papers you're holding aren't worth the ink wasted on them." One of the recovery men had already reached the barn door, and the sound of him trying to break the lock echoed across the morning air. Tom's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure, continuing to record everything. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said, pulling out his phone with his free hand. "Leave now, or I call not just the sheriff, but my lawyer. And trust me, Sarah Chen lives for cases like this, At the mention of Sarah's name, Tom saw the first crack in Victoria's facade. Sarah's reputation for taking down overreaching HOAs was well known in the county, but Victoria quickly recovered, smoothing her jacket with manicured hands. "Mr. Reynolds, you're only making this harder on yourself. These fines will continue to accumulate. The board has been more than patient with your agricultural activities. This equipment is an eyesore, visible from our development, and your constant farming operations are affecting property values in Oakwood Hills." The sound of metal grinding against metal from the barn made Tom's head snap around. They were trying to cut through his lock. His pulse quickened, combat instincts screaming at him to act, but years of discipline kept him in check. Instead, he pressed the speed dial on his phone. "Sarah, they're here. Yes, at the farm, trying to take the equipment now. Yes, I'm recording." He kept his eyes locked on Victoria as he spoke, noting how her confident smirk began to fade. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the morning air. Tom allowed himself a small smile. Butler County's finest had a particular fondness for the veterans programs he ran on his farm, and more than a few of their children had learned about agriculture through his community outreach events. The first patrol car rounded the bend in his access road, followed by two more. Victoria's composed demeanor finally cracked as she saw Sheriff Martinez himself step out of the lead vehicle. The sheriff, a Desert Storm veteran himself, took in the scene with practiced eyes before approaching. "Got a report of attempted theft." "In progress," Martinez said, his hand resting casually on his belt as he surveyed the collection of vehicles and recovery men. "Want to tell me what's going on here, Tom?" Before Tom could answer, Victoria stepped forward with her documents, launching into an explanation about HOA bylaws and enforcement rights. The sheriff listened patiently for a moment before holding up his hand to stop her. "Ma'am, unless you can show me a deed or contract showing this property is part of your association, what I'm seeing is an attempted strong-arm theft of farm equipment worth well over 6 figures. That's grand larceny in this state." The recovery. Men, reading the situation, had already begun backing away from the barn. Victoria's face had gone from confident to uncertain to worried in the space of a few minutes. Tom continued recording, knowing that every second of this would be important for what was coming next. He'd learned in Afghanistan that the best defense was often a good offense. Victoria and her HOA board had just given him all the ammunition he needed for the legal battle ahead. As the recovery vehicles began a hasty retreat under the watchful eyes of the sheriff's deputies, Tom thought about the veterans who relied on his program, about his father's legacy, and about all the other small farmers who faced similar battles. Against development and gentrification, this wasn't just about his equipment anymore. This was about standing up to bullies who thought money and fancy paperwork could trump rights and justice. As he watched Victoria's Mercedes peel out down his access road, Tom was already planning his next moves. The HOA had just made a serious tactical error, and he intended to make them regret it. After the sheriff and his deputies had left, Tom sat in his father's old office, surrounded by 3 generations of farming records and military commendations. His laptop was open to his email, where he'd just finished sending the morning's video footage to Sarah Chen. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages since word got out about the HOA's attempted equipment seizure. The room was exactly as his father had left it. Military memorabilia, sharing wall space with farming awards, a testament to the Reynolds family's dual legacy of service and agriculture. A faded photograph of his father in dress blues stood beside Tom's own Purple Heart, the glass case containing both catching the late morning light. Tom reached for a thick folder from his filing cabinet, decades of property documents organized. With military precision, his hands moved methodically through the papers, pulling out deed records, property surveys, and tax documents. Each piece of evidence clearly showed what he already knew. His farm had never been part of any homeowners association. The property's boundaries had been established long before Oakwood Hills was even a concept, and no easements or amendments had ever been filed. A knock at the door interrupted his documentation review. Mike Torres, his former squad leader and now social media consultant, stood in the doorway. Tom had called him right after the morning's confrontation, knowing they needed to get ahead of the story. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're not going to believe this," Mike said, walking in and setting his tablet on the desk. "Someone from the recovery company posted about this morning's failed operation on their Facebook page. It's already going viral in the local community groups." Tom leaned forward to look at the screen. The post, though quickly deleted, had been screenshot and shared hundreds of times. It detailed how Superior Asset Recovery had been contracted by the Oakwood Hills HOA to seize equipment from a non-compliant resident, conveniently leaving out the fact that said resident was a disabled veteran who wasn't even part of their association. "The comments are overwhelmingly in your favor," Mike continued, scrolling through responses. "Especially after someone recognized your farm and mentioned your veterans program. People are furious." Tom nodded slowly, years of tactical planning kicking in. "We need to control the narrative," he said, pulling out his father's old leather-bound notebook where he'd started documenting every interaction with the HOA. "This isn't just about me anymore." He flipped through pages of notes detailing months of harassment, bogus violation notices, threatening letters, even attempts to have his property rezoned. Each incident had been carefully recorded with military precision: dates, times, participants, and outcomes. "Look at this," he said, showing Mike a series of certified letters he'd sent to the HOA board over the past year. "Every time they claimed jurisdiction over my property, I formally disputed it. They never responded, but kept escalating their actions. That's not just harassment, it's willful misconduct." Mike whistled low as he read through the documentation. "They really thought they could just bully you into submission, didn't they?" "They picked the wrong farmer to intimidate," Tom replied, his voice hard, "and definitely the wrong veteran." Another knock drew their attention. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand, and a determined look on her face. The property. Wright's attorney had made the hour drive from Pittsburgh in record time after Tom's call. "I reviewed the footage you sent," she said, without preamble, pulling out her laptop. "What they attempted this morning wasn't just illegal, it was criminal. Attempted theft, trespassing, harassment, falsifying legal documents." She looked up at Tom. "We're not just playing defense anymore, we're going on the offensive." Tom gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Sarah sat down, immediately spreading out documents. "I've already drafted an emergency injunction to prevent them from making any further attempts at seizure. But that's just the beginning." She pulled up a document on her screen. "Their so-called authorization for seizure. It's completely fabricated. The letterhead is real, but the authorizing judge's signature is forged. I've worked with Judge Henderson for years. This isn't his signature, and his office has no record of issuing any such order." Tom's military training had taught him to recognize turning points in battle. This was one of them. "So we're not just dealing with harassment," he said slowly. "We're looking at criminal forgery." "Exactly," Sarah nodded. "And given the value of the equipment they tried to seize, we're talking about attempted grand larceny with forged documents. That's felony territory." Mike spoke up from where he'd been reviewing social media responses. "We need to get your side of the story out there, Tom. The community's already rallying behind you, but they need to hear from you directly." Tom considered this, looking at the wall of photos behind his desk. Images of 3 generations of Reynolds farmers mixed with military service photos. His grandfather in World War II, his father in Vietnam, himself in Afghanistan. Each of them had fought different battles, but always stood their ground. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this right. No emotional outbursts, no accusations we can't prove. We stick to the facts and let them hang themselves with their own actions." Sarah was already typing. "I'll have the emergency injunction filed within the hour. Then we start building our countersuit. With the evidence of forged documents, we can go after individual board members as well as the HOA itself." Tom nodded, reaching for his father's dog tags around his neck, a habit he'd developed when making important decisions. They thought they could steamroll over a disabled vet who they assumed wouldn't fight back. Time to show them how wrong they were. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows through the office window. Outside, Tom could hear the familiar sounds of his farm, the distant mooing of his neighbor's cattle, the rustle of corn stalks in the breeze, the occasional rumble of farm equipment. This land had been his family's anchor for generations, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone threaten that legacy. The next few days were a blur of activity at Reynolds Family Farm. Tom had converted his father's old office into what Mike jokingly called their war room, with documents spread across every available surface and multiple laptops running constant documentation. The fight was no longer just about preventing an illegal auction. It had become a full-scale investigation into the HOA's activities. Sarah had wasted no time filing their legal responses. The emergency injunction had been granted within hours of submission, thanks in part to the video evidence of the attempted seizure. Judge Henderson, upon learning his signature had been forged, had personally expedited the order. But it was what they discovered while preparing their countersuit that truly opened Pandora's box. Tom sat at his desk, methodically photographing and cataloguing every piece of equipment the HOA had attempted to seize. Each item told its own story. The modified John Deere tractor he'd adapted for use with his prosthetic leg, the specialized harvesting equipment that allowed him to run his veterans program, the custom irrigation systems that had cost him years of savings to install. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to her laptop screen. She'd been digging through county records all morning. In the past 2 years, Oakwood Hills HOA has attempted similar actions against 4 other property owners in the county. All of them small farmers, all of them bordering their development. Tom leaned forward, scanning the documents. What happened to these farms? 2 sold under pressure, but still fighting them in court. The 4th, Sarah paused, pulling up another document. The 4th belonged to an elderly couple who couldn't afford to fight. They lost their equipment in a similar auction and had to sell their land. At a fraction of its value, the revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. He thought about his own veterans program, about the men and women who found healing in working this land, about how easily it could have all been taken away if he hadn't had the resources and support to fight back. "There's more," Mike called. From where he was working with his tablet, "I've been tracking the property sales after these farms were forced out. Every single parcel was purchased by shell companies that all trace back to one developer, Victoria Pierce's husband's firm." Tom's jaw clenched. He'd seen similar tactics in Afghanistan. Powerful entities pressuring vulnerable populations, using paperwork and bureaucracy as weapons. But he'd never expected to face such battles on home soil. The documentation phase was crucial, not just for their legal case, but for the story they needed to tell. Tom had spent hours photographing every piece of equipment, creating detailed inventories with purchase prices, modifications, and current market values. Each photo included GPS coordinates and timestamps, creating an irrefutable record of what the HOA had attempted to steal. "The total value we're looking at," Tom said, reviewing his spreadsheet, "is $238,547 for the equipment alone. That's not counting the custom modifications for disabled access or the specialized teaching tools for the veterans program." Sarah nodded, making notes. And that's important because it elevates this from attempted theft to attempted grand larceny. The forged documents make it a conspiracy charge. Each board member who approved this action could be personally liable. Mike looked up from his research. "You need to see this," he said, turning his tablet around. "I've been tracking the HOA's financial records, public documents they're required to file. There's a pattern here. Every time they force out a farmer, there's a large consulting fee paid to a company called VP Development Solutions." "Let me guess," Tom said grimly. "VP stands for Victoria Pierce?" "Got it in one," Mike confirmed. "She's been playing both sides, using the HOA to force sales, then profiting from the development deals through her company. It's all technically legal on paper, but combined with the forged documents and illegal seizure attempts, it's a pattern of organized criminal activity," Sarah finished. She was already typing furiously. "This changes our approach. We're not just filing a civil suit anymore. We need to get the district attorney involved." Tom stood up, moving to the window. Outside, he could see two of his veteran students working in the training garden, one in a wheelchair, the other using a cane similar to his own. They were part of why he couldn't back down. This farm wasn't just his livelihood, it was a sanctuary for others who'd served. "Do it," he said, turning back to Sarah. "But I want everything absolutely bulletproof. Victoria Pierce has friends in high places. We get one shot at this." The next few hours were spent organizing their findings. Every document was scanned, every piece of evidence catalogued, every connection mapped out. Tom's military training served him well. He approached the task with the same precision he'd once used in mission planning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm, Tom stood on his porch with Mike and Sarah, watching his veteran students finish their day's work in the fields. The evening light caught his father's dog tags, still hanging around his neck, reminding him of everything at stake. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start pushing back. Not just for my farm, but for everyone they've bullied and threatened. It's time to show them what happens when you pick a fight with someone who's actually trained for battle." Sarah nodded, closing her laptop. "I'll file first thing in the morning. Once we submit this evidence, there's no going back." "Good," Tom replied, his voice firm. "Because I'm done playing defense. It's time to take the fight to them." Tom sat across from District Attorney Marcus Rodriguez in a wood-paneled office in downtown Butler, watching as the DA methodically reviewed their evidence. Sarah sat beside him while Mike waited outside, continuing to compile social media evidence of the HOA's pattern of harassment. The morning sun, filtering through the windows, cast long shadows across the stack of documents they'd presented. "This is—" Rodriguez paused, adjusting his reading glasses as he studied the forged authorization document. "This is far more serious than typical HOA overreach. You're telling me they attempted to seize nearly $250,000 worth of equipment using forged court documents?" Sarah leaned forward, pulling out additional files from her briefcase. "That's just the beginning, Marcus. We've uncovered a pattern of similar attempts against other local farmers. Look at these property records." She spread out a series of documents across his desk. Every farm they've successfully pressured out of business was quickly rezoned and developed by companies connected to Victoria Pierce's husband. The DA's expression darkened as he reviewed the documentation. Tom noticed how his hands tightened on the papers. Rodriguez was a local, born and raised in Butler County. He understood what these family farms meant to the community. "And this veterans program you run," Rodriguez looked up at Tom. "They were fully aware of it when they attempted the seizure." Tom nodded, pulling out a thick folder. "We have copies of all our correspondence with them. Multiple letters explaining the program's importance to disabled veterans, the specialized nature of the equipment, everything. They knew exactly what they were trying to destroy." "The equipment modifications alone," Sarah added, "represent tens of thousands of dollars in specialized adaptations for disabled veterans. The hand controls, the custom lifts, the safety systems, all of it documented and certified by the VA's adaptive farming program. Rodriguez stood, moving to his window that overlooked the county courthouse. Butler was changing. Everyone knew it. Development was creeping in from Pittsburgh's expanding suburbs, but this was something different. This was systematic exploitation. "There's something else you should see," Tom said quietly, pulling out his father's leather notebook. "My father started documenting strange activity around our property lines back in 2019, just before he passed. Survey stakes appearing overnight, unauthorized soil samples, photographs being taken of our equipment. We didn't know what it meant then, but now it fits the pattern." Rodriguez finished, returning to his desk. "They were targeting your farm before you even inherited it." Sarah produced another document. "We've also discovered that Superior Asset Recovery, the company they hired for the attempted seizure, has been involved in similar actions across 3 counties. Always working with homeowners associations, always targeting family farms near developing areas." The DA picked up the forged court order again, studying Judge Henderson's falsified signature. "Kent Henderson has been a friend of mine for 20 years. The fact that they'd forge his signature—" He set the document down firmly. "This stops now." Tom felt a familiar tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He'd seen that look before, in commanders who'd made up their minds to take action. Rodriguez was no longer just listening. He was preparing to move. "Here's what we're going to do," the DA said, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling in the County Financial Crimes Unit. We'll need forensic accountants to trace all these shell companies and development deals. Miss Chen, I want every piece of documentation you have about the other affected farms. Mr. Reynolds, we'll need detailed statements from your veteran students about how this attempted seizure would have impacted their rehabilitation program." Sarah was already pulling out more files. "I can have statements from 2 other farmers by this afternoon. They've been waiting for someone to finally take action." "Against the HOA and the social media evidence?" Rodriguez asked. "My former squad leader is outside," Tom replied. "He's documented hundreds of comments and posts showing a clear pattern of harassment and intimidation by the HOA, including some rather incriminating statements from board members themselves." The DA nodded, making notes. "Good. Social media posts have broken more than a few cases wide open. People tend to be more honest when they think they're just talking to their friends online." A knock at the door interrupted them. Rodriguez's assistant entered with a fresh stack of papers. "Sir, Judge Henderson is here. He'd like to speak with you about the forged documents." "Even better," Rodriguez said, standing. "We'll need his formal statement about never authorizing any such order." He looked at Tom and Sarah. "This is going to take time to build properly, but I want you to know, we're not just looking at civil charges anymore. What you've uncovered here appears to be systematic criminal activity. Real estate fraud, document forgery, attempted grand larceny, conspiracy." Tom gripped his cane tighter, thinking about all the other farmers who hadn't been able to fight back. How long? "He has to do it right. A few weeks to build the criminal case. We'll need to coordinate with the State Attorney General's office, given the multi-county nature of these operations. But," Rodriguez smiled grimly, "I think we can arrange for some search warrants much sooner than that, starting with the HOA offices and Ms. Pierce's development company." As they left the DA's office an hour later, Tom felt a familiar surge of anticipation, the same feeling he'd had before important missions. But this time, instead of leading soldiers into battle, he was leading a charge for justice. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike. More veterans had come forward with stories about other HOAs using similar tactics against their properties. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said, reading the message over his shoulder. "Good," Tom replied, starting down the courthouse steps. Because I'm not stopping until we shut down every last one of these operations. They picked the wrong veteran to mess with. The news of an impending criminal investigation spread through Butler County's farming community like wildfire. By the time Tom returned to his farm that afternoon, his phone was flooded with messages from other farmers sharing similar experiences with aggressive HOAs and development companies. Frank Miller, whose dairy farm bordered Tom's property to the north, was the first to arrive. The elderly farmer had been fighting his own battle against a different HOA's attempts to classify his cattle as nuisance livestock. Behind Frank came the Hendersons, the Patels, and the Ramirez family, all local farmers who'd faced similar pressure from various homeowners associations. Tom gathered them in his barn, which had become their unofficial headquarters. Mike had set up a makeshift presentation area, displaying maps that showed the pattern of farm acquisitions and development across the county. Red pins marked properties that had been forced into sales, while blue ones indicated farms currently under HOA pressure. What we're seeing here isn't isolated, Tom explained, using his cane to point at the map. It's systematic. They target farms near developing areas, manufacture violations, then either force sales or attempt equipment seizures to cripple operations. Sarah, who had stayed to meet with the farmers, added, "The DA's office is particularly interested in cases where HOAs claimed jurisdiction over properties that were never part of their associations. That's not just harassment, it's fraud." Maria Ramirez stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she held out a stack of papers. Like these? The documents were nearly identical to the ones Tom had received. Fake violations, unauthorized fines, threats of equipment seizure. They tried to tell me my tractors were improperly stored because they were visible from their development. My family has farmed that land for 4 generations. The pattern was clear. Each farmer had similar stories, similar documents, similar threats. The HOAs used almost identical language in their notices, suggesting coordination between different associations. "The district attorney's office is preparing search warrants," Sarah informed the group. "But we need to document everything, every letter, every interaction, every attempt at intimidation." Tom watched as his fellow farmers shared their stories, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. The HOAs hadn't just targeted him, they'd been waging a systematic campaign against small farmers throughout the county. "There's something else," Frank said, pulling out his phone. "My grandson did some digging online. All these different HOAs, they all use the same property management company. And guess who owns it?" "Victoria Pierce's husband," Tom finished grimly. "The same developer buying up the forced sales." The revelation sent a murmur through the gathered farmers. It wasn't just Oakwood Hills, it was an entire network of HOAs working in concert with developers to force out small farmers. Mike, who had been quietly documenting everything, spoke up. "We've started a private social media group for affected farmers. Already have over 50 members from 3 counties. Each one has similar documentation of harassment and attempted property seizures." Tom moved to the barn door, looking out over his fields, where 2 veteran students were working with adapted equipment, the same equipment the HOA had tried to seize. The sight strengthened his resolve. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced, turning back to the group. "Sarah's setting up a secure document drop for evidence. Mike's coordinating our social media response. The DA's office wants statements from everyone affected. But most importantly, we stick together. No more fighting these battles alone." Frank nodded, standing slowly. "They thought they could pick us off one by one. Didn't count on a stubborn veteran getting us organized." The meeting continued as more farmers arrived, each bringing their own evidence of HOA harassment. Tom's barn, which had been designed to house equipment, had become command central for what was quickly evolving into a county-wide resistance against predatory development practices. By sunset, they had compiled enough documentation to fill several boxes, evidence that would soon be headed to the DA's office. The farmers left with a new sense of purpose, knowing they were no longer fighting alone. "This is just the beginning," Sarah said as she packed up her files. "Once the search warrants are executed, we'll have access to their internal communications. If what we suspect is true about the coordination between HOAs, then Victoria Pierce and her associates are in for one hell of a wake-up call," Tom finished, watching the last of the farmer's trucks disappear down his access road. The day had transformed what started as his personal battle into something much larger, a fight for the future of Butler County's farming community. The investigation into the HOA's activities deepened as Laura sifted through the mountain of evidence pouring in from affected farmers. In Judge Henderson's chambers, she and Tom watched as the judge methodically reviewed the falsified documents bearing his forged signature. "This is troubling," Henderson said, holding one document under his desk lamp. "Not just the forgery, but the scope of it. They've been using my name to legitimize their actions for months." Tom nodded, his military training recognizing the telltale signs of a well-orchestrated operation. The forged signatures weren't random. They were part of a calculated strategy to add legitimacy to their illegal actions. "Your Honor," Laura began, pulling out another file, "we've uncovered similar documents from 3 other counties, all bearing your signature, all authorizing equipment seizures from farms bordering HOA developments." The judge's face darkened. "Show me everything." For the next hour, they laid out the pattern. Each document followed the same template, used the same language, and carried the same forged signature. The consistency suggested a single source. "There's more," Tom added, opening his laptop. "Our forensic accountant found something interesting in the HOA's financial records. Every time they successfully forced a farm sale, large consulting fees were paid through a series of shell companies, all leading back to VP Development Solutions." Henderson leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses. "Victoria Pierce's company?" "Yes, sir, but here's where it gets interesting," Tom continued, pulling up a spreadsheet. "The consulting fees exactly match the difference between the distressed sale prices of the farms and their market value. They weren't just forcing sales, they were pocketing the difference through fake consulting contracts." Laura spread out property maps across the judge's desk. Each seized farm was quickly rezoned and developed. The HOA provided the pressure, Pierce's husband's company handled the development, and VP Development Solutions collected the profits. It's a perfect closed loop. "And they're using my name to make it all look legitimate," Henderson said, his voice tight with anger. He reached for his phone. "Marcus, it's Kent. You need to see this. Bring your financial crimes unit now." While they waited for the DA, Tom received a text from Mike. The social media investigation had uncovered private HOA board messages discussing their strategy. Screenshots showing board members openly joking about squeezing out farmers and making examples of those who resisted. The DA arrived with 2 investigators, and the chamber quickly transformed into an impromptu war room. The evidence was damning. Forged judicial orders, fraudulent financial transactions, coordinated harassment campaigns. "This goes beyond civil violations," Rodriguez said, reviewing the documents. "We're looking at RICO charges, criminal conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, forgery of judicial documents." Tom thought about the farmers who'd lost everything to this scheme, about the elderly couple forced to sell their century-old dairy farm for pennies on the dollar, about his own veterans. Program that had nearly been destroyed. "How soon can we move?" he asked. The DA consulted with his team. "Search warrants for the HOA offices and Pierce's companies by morning. But we need to coordinate with state authorities. This crosses county lines." Judge Henderson was already signing the warrants. "Do it right," he said. "Make it stick." As they left the courthouse, Laura turned to Tom. "This is bigger than we imagined. They've been using these tactics across the state. Tom gripped his cane, thinking of all the farms already lost. Then we make sure it stops here. They thought they could hide behind paperwork and legal threats. Time to show them what happens when they target someone who knows how to fight back. Back at his farm, Tom found his veteran students still working the fields. The sight strengthened. His resolve. This wasn't just about protecting farms anymore. It was about standing up to systematic corruption that preyed on vulnerable communities. His phone buzzed with another message from Mike. More farmers had come forward, more evidence had surfaced. The wave was building, and soon it would crash over Victoria Pierce and her entire operation. Looking out over his fields, Tom remembered his father's words. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought right here at home. How right he'd been. But this was one battle Tom intended to win, not just for his farm, but for every farmer who'd been bullied, threatened, or forced out by these predatory practices. The war room in his barn was ready. Tomorrow, when the search warrants were executed, Phase 2 would begin. Victoria Pierce was about to learn that some veterans never stop fighting for what's right. The early morning silence at Reynolds Family Farm was broken by the sound of multiple vehicles approaching. Tom stood on his porch, watching as FBI vehicles and county sheriff's cruisers rolled up his driveway. Today was the day. Search warrants were being executed simultaneously at the Oakwood Hills HOA office, Victoria Pierce's development company, and several related businesses. Deputy Director Matthews, whom Tom recognized from their previous meetings, approached the porch. "Mr. Reynolds, we'll need you to walk us through the equipment they attempted to seize. Everything needs to be photographed and documented as evidence." Tom led the federal forensics team through his barn, detailing each piece of equipment, its value, and the specialized modifications for disabled veterans. The team meticulously photographed and catalogued everything, building their case piece by piece. "They're hitting Pierce's office now," Matthews said, checking his phone. "Already found shredders running. Looks like they tried to destroy evidence, but our cyber team is on site. Deleted files can be recovered." Sarah arrived shortly after, carrying new files. "The State Attorney General's office just approved expanding the investigation. They've linked similar schemes in 4 other counties, all using the same forged judicial signatures, all targeting farms near planned developments." Tom's phone buzzed continuously with updates from Mike, who was monitoring social media reactions. The news of the raids had leaked, and former HOA board members were starting to turn on each other publicly. "Look at this," Mike texted. "Former treasurer just posted that Victoria Pierce ordered them to target specific farms. Says she had maps marking which properties to pressure first." The investigation team set up additional equipment in Tom's barn, creating a mobile command center. Screens displayed real-time updates from other raid locations, while forensic accountants pored over financial records. "We've got something," one analyst called out. "Found emails between Pierce and Superior Asset Recovery. They were planning equipment seizures from multiple farms, all using the same forged court orders." Tom watched as the evidence mounted. Each new discovery revealed the true scope of the operation. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about exposing a systematic attack on farming communities. "Mr. Reynolds," Matthews approached with a grim expression, "we found documentation about your father's farm. They've been planning this since before he passed. They were waiting for a vulnerable moment to strike." The revelation hit Tom hard. He gripped his cane tighter, thinking about his father's final days. The mysterious surveyors, the unexplained photographs, it all made sense now. Sarah was already documenting the new evidence. This proves premeditation. They specifically targeted farms owned by elderly or disabled farmers, thinking they'd be easier to pressure. The day progressed with a steady stream of discoveries. Each hour brought new evidence of corruption, new connections between seemingly separate entities, all leading back to Victoria Pierce and her network of fraudulent HOAs. By evening, the scope of the operation had become clear. Dozens of farms targeted, millions in fraudulent transactions, forged documents spanning multiple jurisdictions. The FBI had seized computers, files and hard drives from 7 different locations. "They're bringing Victoria Pierce in for questioning," Matthews announced. "Found her trying to board a private plane at Butler County Airport. She had a suitcase full of documents and 3 passports." Tom stood at his barn door, watching the sunset over his fields. The same fields his father had worked, that he now used to help fellow veterans heal. Fields that Pierce and her associates had tried to steal through fraud and intimidation. "We've got them," Sarah said quietly, joining him. "The evidence is overwhelming. This isn't just going to stop their operation. It's going to expose similar schemes across the state." Tom nodded, thinking of all the farmers who'd lost their land, all the families displaced by these predatory practices. "Sure, every detail is documented," he said. "Every farmer they targeted, every dollar they stole, every fake document they created. No plea deals, no settlements. They face everything they've done." As the investigation teams packed up for the day, Tom received one final update from Mike. The story had gone national. Farmers across the country were coming forward with similar stories, revealing a pattern of HOA abuse that stretched far beyond Butler County. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Victoria Pierce's empire of fraud was crumbling, and with it, the network of corrupt HOAs she had built. Tom thought of his father, of his own service, of the veterans who found purpose on his farm. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought overseas, but right here at home. The atmosphere in the Butler County courthouse was tense as Victoria Pierce was led into the courtroom for her arraignment. Tom sat in the front row beside Sarah, watching as the woman who had tried to destroy his farm faced the consequences of her actions. The list of charges took nearly 10 minutes to read: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, forgery of judicial documents, attempted grand larceny, and racketeering. Pierce's carefully maintained facade had crumbled. Her designer suit was wrinkled, her makeup less than perfect, her usual confident smirk replaced by a look of barely contained panic. Behind her, 3 other HOA board members waited for their own arraignments, all having turned on each other in desperate attempts to secure plea deals. District Attorney Rodriguez laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged court orders, fraudulent financial transactions, documented patterns of harassment, and explicit emails discussing their targeting of vulnerable farmers. The defendant orchestrated a complex criminal enterprise. Rodriguez stated, his voice firm. Using homeowners associations as a front, she and her co-conspirators systematically targeted family farms, particularly those owned by elderly or disabled farmers, in an attempt to force distressed sales for personal profit. Tom listened as the prosecutor detailed how Pierce's operation had worked. The HOAs would claim jurisdiction over farms that were never part of their associations, issue fraudulent violations, then attempt to seize equipment or force sales. The properties would then be purchased at below-market rates through shell companies, rezoned and developed for massive profits. The financial evidence was particularly damning. Forensic accountants had traced millions of dollars flowing through a complex web of shell companies, all leading back to Pierce and her associates. Each forced farm sale corresponded with large consulting fees paid to Pierce's companies, fees that matched the difference between the distressed sale price and market value. Sarah leaned over to whisper to Tom. They found evidence of similar operations in 3 other states. Federal prosecutors are getting involved. The judge, clearly disturbed by the scope of the fraud, denied Pierce's request for bail. The defendant, has demonstrated both the means and inclination to flee prosecution, as evidenced by her attempted departure with multiple passports and offshore account documentation. As Pierce was led away in handcuffs, Tom thought about all the farmers who'd lost their land to her schemes. The elderly couple forced to sell their dairy farm, the disabled Vietnam veteran who lost his orchards, the young family whose equipment was illegally seized. Each one represented a life upended by greed and corruption. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Tom and Sarah. The case had captured national attention, highlighting the growing issue of predatory development practices targeting agricultural communities. "This isn't just about one corrupt HOA," Tom stated firmly. "This is about protecting family farms from systematic exploitation. What happened here in Butler County is happening across the country, and it needs to stop." The aftermath of the arraignment brought more developments. Former HOA board members, facing their own criminal charges, began providing evidence against Pierce and her network. Documents emerged showing similar operations being planned in other counties, all using the same fraudulent tactics. Back at his farm, Tom met with other affected farmers. The FBI had set up a dedicated hotline for victims of HOA fraud, and reports were pouring in from across the state. What had started as one veteran defending his farm had evolved into a nationwide examination of HOA overreach and developer fraud. "They thought we'd be easy targets," Frank Miller said, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee. "Figured farmers wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. Didn't count on running into a combat veteran who knew how to organize a resistance." Tom looked out over his fields, where his veteran students continued their work, undisturbed by the legal battles being fought on their behalf. The HOA's attempt to seize his equipment had threatened more than just his livelihood. It had threatened a program that gave wounded warriors a chance to heal through agriculture. "The fight's not over," Sarah reminded them, reviewing new case files, "but we've dealt them a serious blow. Pierce's arrest is just the beginning. We're going after every corrupt HOA, every fraudulent developer, every scheme targeting family and farms." For Tom, it was another kind of victory, not one with weapons or tactics, but with determination, documentation, and the courage to stand up against systematic corruption. His father's dog tags caught the afternoon light, reminding him that some battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in hometown courtrooms and family farms. The federal investigation into Victoria Pierce's HOA fraud network expanded rapidly. In the weeks following her arrest, Tom sat in his farmhouse kitchen reviewing the latest updates from the FBI's investigation with Sarah and Mike. The scope of Pierce's operation had proven far larger than anyone initially suspected. "They've identified over 30 farms targeted across 4 states, Sarah said, spreading new documents across the table. "Same pattern everywhere: fraudulent HOA claims, forged court documents, attempted equipment seizures. The total damages are estimated at over $12 million. Mike, monitoring the growing online community of affected farmers, added, "More victims coming forward every day. The FBI's victim hotline is overwhelmed. They're setting up a dedicated task force just for HOA-related farm fraud cases." Tom's phone buzzed with a text from District Attorney Rodriguez. The State Attorney General had approved expanding the RICO charges to include Pierce's entire network of shell companies and property management firms. The case was now officially the largest HOA fraud investigation in state history. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to a newly unsealed document. They found Pierce's playbook, detailed instructions on how to target vulnerable farms, focusing on disabled owners, veterans, elderly farmers. They even had a scoring system for how likely a farmer was to give up without a fight. The discovery made Tom's jaw clench. His own farm had been marked as a high-priority target due to his combat, injury, and recent inheritance. They'd seen his disability as a weakness to exploit, never considering that his military training would make him their worst nightmare. Frank Miller arrived with more news from the farming community. The exposure of Pierce's operation had sparked a nationwide movement. Farmers were organizing legal defense networks, sharing documentation of HOA harassment, and pushing for legislative changes to prevent similar schemes. "They're calling it the Farm Protection Coalition," Frank explained. "Started right here with your fight, Tom. Now we've got chapters forming in 12 states. The movement was gaining political attention. State legislators were drafting bills to strengthen protections for agricultural land against predatory development practices. Tom's story had become a rallying cry for rural communities facing similar threats. "The FBI found something else," Sarah said, pulling out her laptop. "Emails between Pierce and several other developers. They were planning to expand their operation, targeting hundreds more farms across the Midwest. Your stand didn't just stop their local operation. It prevented them from going national." Tom stood at his kitchen window, watching his veteran students work the fields. The equipment the HOA had tried to seize was being put to its intended use, helping wounded warriors find purpose through agriculture. The attempted theft had backfired spectacularly, exposing a criminal enterprise and launching a movement for change. "The DA's office is preparing for trial," Sarah continued. "They are not interested in plea deals. They want to make an example of this case, show other developers that targeting family farms has consequences." Mike's tablet displayed news coverage from across the country. Similar investigations were being launched in other states, examining suspicious patterns of HOA expansion into agricultural areas. Tom's fight had opened a floodgate, exposing a nationwide problem that had gone unchecked for too long. "You know what this means," Frank said, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "They'll think twice before trying these tactics again. Every farmer they target now knows exactly how to fight back." Tom nodded, touching his father's dog, Tags. The battle hadn't just been about protecting his farm. It had become something larger, a stand against systematic corruption that threatened a way of life. His military training had taught him that sometimes the most important victories aren't won through force, but through exposure and justice. The sun was setting over his fields, casting long shadows across the land his family had worked for generations. The HOA had seen it as just another property to acquire, never understanding that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. "We're not done," Tom said firmly. "Not until every farmer who lost land to these schemes gets justice. Not until laws are in place to protect others from these tactics. This was never just about my farm. It's about making sure no one else has to face what we faced." The trial of Victoria Pierce and her co-conspirators became a watershed moment for agricultural communities across the nation. The Butler County courthouse was packed as prosecutors presented their case, methodically exposing the full scope of the HOA fraud operation. Tom sat stoically through each day of testimony, his presence a constant reminder of the farmers who had fought back. Expert witnesses detailed the sophisticated fraud scheme, forged documents, manipulated property records, and a complex web of shell companies designed to hide millions in illegal profits. The defendants didn't just attack farms, the prosecutor argued. They targeted the most vulnerable members of our agricultural community. Veterans, elderly farmers, disabled owners, all chosen because they were seen as easy targets. FBI analysts presented evidence from Pierce's seized computers, including spreadsheets ranking farms by vulnerability factors. Tom's own farm had been marked as prime acquisition due to his combat injury and recent inheritance. The jury's faces hardened as they viewed emails joking about crippled vets being unable to fight back. Sarah, sitting beside Tom, watched the jury's reactions carefully. "They're connecting with the evidence," she whispered. "Every email, every forged document shows the deliberate targeting of disabled veterans. It's hitting home." The defense tried to paint the actions as routine property development, but their arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence. Former HOA board members, testifying as part of plea deals, detailed how Pierce had orchestrated the entire operation. "She told us to target the veterans first," one former board member testified, "said their disabilities would make them easier to pressure. When Mr. Reynolds fought back, she became obsessed with making an example of him." The financial evidence was equally damning. Forensic accountants traced millions in stolen equity, showing how Pierce's operation had systematically undervalued seized farms before flipping them for massive profits through shell companies. During a break in proceedings, Tom received updates from Mike about the growing national impact. The Farm Protection Coalition had expanded to 20 states, with lawyers and advocates sharing strategies to fight HOA overreach. Legislative committees were drafting new laws specifically addressing predatory development practices targeting agricultural land. "Your stand did more than expose one corrupt operation," Mike said, showing Tom the latest news coverage. "It's changing how these cases are handled nationwide. Farmers aren't easy targets anymore. The prosecution's closing arguments were powerful, focusing on the human cost of Pierce's schemes. They showed before and after satellite images of farms lost to the fraud, each one representing a family's legacy destroyed for profit. The defendants saw disabled veterans like Mr. Reynolds as vulnerable targets," the prosecutor concluded. "Instead, they learned that America's veterans never stop fighting for what's right." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. As the verdicts were read, guilty on all counts, Tom thought about every farmer who had lost their land, every family displaced by greed and corruption. Pierce faced decades in prison, her empire of fraud dismantled. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters from the farming community, Tom addressed the gathered media. "This verdict sends a message. Our farms are not just property to be seized. Our disabilities are not weaknesses to be exploited. Today, justice prevailed not just for my farm, but for every farmer who's faced these predatory tactics." Sarah stayed late at the farm that evening, reviewing new cases from other states. The victory had opened the floodgates, with similar investigations launching across the country. Tom's fight had become a blueprint for other farmers facing HOA. Harassment. "We've created a precedent," Sarah explained. "Every case now builds on what we proved here. They can't hide behind fake documents and fraudulent claims anymore." Tom stood on his porch, watching the sun set over fields that had nearly been lost to corruption. His veteran students were finishing their day's work, their adapted equipment, the same equipment Pierce had tried to seize, helping them rebuild their lives through agriculture. The aftermath of Pierce's conviction brought widespread changes to farm protection laws across the state. Tom found himself at the center of a growing movement, testifying before the state legislature about the need for stronger safeguards against predatory development practices. "As a disabled veteran, I fought overseas for our rights," Tom addressed the legislative committee. "I never expected to fight another battle here at home, defending family farms from organized fraud. The proposed Reynolds Act would make it a felony for HOAs to claim jurisdiction over non-member properties or attempt unauthorized equipment seizures." The bill garnered bipartisan support, with legislators recognizing the urgent need to protect agricultural communities. Sarah had expanded her practice, creating a dedicated unit for defending farmers against development harassment. Her office walls now displayed maps tracking similar cases across the country, each pin representing a family fighting to preserve their legacy. "The conviction changed everything," she explained during a strategy session at Tom's farm. "Courts now recognize these aren't isolated incidents, but coordinated attacks on farming communities." Pierce's case set precedents that are helping farmers nationwide. The FBI's investigation continued expanding, uncovering similar operations in other states. Tom worked closely with federal investigators, helping them identify patterns he'd first noticed in his own battle. His military experience proved invaluable in tracking complex networks of shell companies and fraudulent documentation. Mike's social media campaign had evolved into a nationwide resource network. The Farm Protection Coalition's website now served as a central hub for documenting HOA harassment and connecting farmers with legal support. Tom's story became a case study in effective resistance against corporate land grabs. At the farm, Tom's Veterans Program flourished. The publicity from the trial had brought new support and resources. Additional adaptive equipment allowed more disabled veterans to participate, turning the farm into a model for agricultural therapy programs. Frank Miller and other local farmers organized regular meetings in Tom's barn, sharing intelligence about suspicious development activities and coordinating legal responses. The community had learned the power of unified resistance. Remember when they thought targeting a disabled vet would be easy? Frank chuckled during one meeting. Bet they wish they'd picked someone else's farm to mess with. The impact rippled beyond Butler County. State after state began examining their HOA regulations, closing loopholes that allowed abuse of agricultural properties. Tom received regular calls from farmers' advocacy groups, seeking his advice on organizing effective resistance to development pressure. The fight's not over, Tom reminded his supporters, but now we know how to win. Every farmer who stands up, every case we document, makes it harder for these predators to operate. Sarah brought news of Pierce's assets being seized and redistributed. Farms lost to her schemes were being returned to their original owners or their families, along with compensation for lost equipment and revenues. This is what justice looks like, Tom said, watching elderly farmers return to lands they'd been forced to abandon. Not just punishing the guilty, but restoring what was stolen. The veterans working his fields represented everything Pierce's operation had tried to destroy: resilience, adaptation, community. Each adapted piece of equipment, each modified control system told a story of overcoming challenges through innovation and determination. Tom stood at his property line, where survey stakes from Pierce's development plans had once marked the intended destruction of his farm. Now that boundary represented a line in the sand, a point where corrupt developers had finally met resistance they couldn't overcome. His father's dog tags caught the evening light as he surveyed his fields. The battle had changed him, transformed a personal fight into a national movement. But the core principle remained the same. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The sun set over Reynolds Family Farm, casting long shadows across land that would remain agricultural for generations to come, protected not just by new laws, but by the strength of a community that had learned to stand together against those who would destroy their way of life. 6 months after Pierce's conviction, Tom found himself facing an unexpected challenge. The story of his fight against HOA fraud had caught national attention, and agricultural communities across the country were calling for his help. "We need you in Washington," Sarah announced, holding up an official letter. "The Senate Agricultural Committee wants you to testify about HOA fraud targeting farms. Your case has become the catalyst for federal legislation." Tom sat at his kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through windows that had witnessed generations of farmers fighting their own battles. This one, however, was different. This wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It was about changing the system that had allowed predators like Pierce to target vulnerable farmers nationwide. The Farm Protection Coalition had identified over 200 cases similar to his across the country. Each one followed the same pattern: fraudulent HOA claims, forged documents, attempted equipment seizures. The tactics Pierce had pioneered had spread like a cancer through the development industry. "The FBI's investigation has gone federal," Mike reported, showing Tom the latest updates on his tablet. "They've linked Pierce's operation to developer networks in 12 states. Your documentation methods are being used as a template for other investigations." Tom's veteran rehabilitation program had expanded, now serving as a model for similar initiatives nationwide. The adaptive equipment that Pierce had tried to seize was being replicated on other farms, helping disabled veterans find purpose through agriculture. "It's not just about farming anymore," Tom explained to his students as they worked the fields. "It's about protecting a way of life that gives people second chances." The proposed federal legislation, dubbed the Agricultural Communities Protection Act, incorporated many of the safeguards Tom had fought for. It would create special protections for farms near developing areas, impose harsh penalties for fraudulent HOA claims, and establish a fast-track legal process for farmers facing equipment seizure threats. Sarah had become a leading expert in agricultural property rights, consulting with lawmakers and advocacy groups. Pierce's conviction showed these weren't isolated incidents, she explained during a strategy session. It exposed a systematic attempt to destroy family farms through fraud and intimidation. Frank Miller and other local farmers had transformed Tom's barn into a regional command center for fighting development fraud. Maps covered the walls, tracking suspicious HOA activity and coordinating responses. The days of farmers facing these battles alone were over. "Remember when they thought targeting a disabled veteran would be their easiest victory?" Frank mused, studying the maps. "Instead, they launched a nationwide resistance movement." Tom's father's dog tag still hung around his neck as he prepared for his testimony in Washington. They reminded him that some battles choose you, that fighting for what's right sometimes means stepping into a larger arena than you ever expected. The sun set over Reynolds Family Farm, casting long shadows across fields that had become more than just agricultural land. They were now a symbol of resistance against corruption, a beacon of hope for farming communities facing similar threats. As Tom reviewed his testimony notes, he thought about how far the fight had come from that morning, when he first discovered the HOA's fraudulent seizure notice. What began as one veteran defending his farm had evolved into a national movement for change. "They thought my disability made me vulnerable," Tom told his gathered supporters. "Instead, it taught me that the strongest defense is building a community that stands together. That's what we're fighting for now, not just our farms, but our right to protect what matters most." Tom stood before the Senate Agricultural Committee, his cane steady beside him as he addressed the packed chamber. The faces of senators, journalists, and fellow farmers looked back at him, all drawn by the story of one disabled veteran's fight against systematic HOA fraud. "What began as an attempt to steal my farm equipment has exposed a national crisis," Tom testified. "Family farms across this country are being targeted through fraudulent HOA claims and forged documents. This isn't just about property rights. It's about preserving our agricultural heritage and protecting those who've served this nation." The evidence he presented was compelling. Maps showing patterns of predatory development, financial records tracing millions in stolen farm equity, testimonies from veterans and elderly farmers who'd lost everything to similar schemes. Each document represented another family's battle against corruption. Senator Richardson, the committee chair, leaned forward. "Mr. Reynolds, you've provided evidence of over 200 cases similar to yours. How many of these targeted disabled veterans or elderly farmers?" "Nearly 70%, Tom replied, his voice firm. "They specifically chose targets they thought wouldn't have the resources or ability to fight back. In my case, they saw my combat injury as a weakness. Instead, it became their undoing." Sarah, sitting behind Tom, provided additional legal context. The pattern of fraud crossed state lines, used interstate banking systems, and involved coordinated criminal enterprises, all elements that demanded federal intervention. Back at Reynolds Family Farm, Mike coordinated live updates to farming communities nationwide. The hearing was being streamed in barns and community centers across the country, each venue filled with farmers who'd faced similar battles. During my service, Tom continued, I learned that the strongest defense is a united front. That's what we've built here, a network of farmers, advocates, and communities standing together against systematic fraud. The proposed legislation would create a federal task force specifically focused on agricultural fraud, establish harsh penalties for HOA overreach, and provide legal resources for targeted farmers. Most importantly, it would protect programs, like Tom's, that helped disabled veterans find new purpose through farming. The equipment they tried to seize wasn't just farm machinery, Tom explained. It was adapted technology that helped wounded warriors rebuild their lives. Each piece represented another veteran's chance at recovery. The committee members studied photos of Tom's veterans program, disabled soldiers working adapted equipment, finding healing in the same fields that developers had tried to steal. The contrast between Pierce's greed and the program's purpose couldn't have been starker. As Tom concluded his testimony, Senator Richardson made an unprecedented announcement. The committee would fast-track the Agricultural Communities Protection Act, adding special provisions for veteran-owned farms and rehabilitation programs. Mr. Reynolds, the senator stated, your fight has exposed a national scandal. This legislation will ensure that no other farmer, veteran or civilian, faces these battles alone. Outside the hearing room, Tom met with representatives from farming communities across the country. Each had their own story of resistance, their own battle against fraudulent development schemes. What started in Butler County had become a nationwide movement for change. Sarah reviewed the proposed legislation with satisfaction. This goes beyond anything we imagined when we first fought Pierce's operation. You've changed how these cases will be handled for generations. The impact of Tom's Senate testimony rippled through farming communities nationwide. The proposed Agricultural Communities Protection Act gained momentum, drawing bipartisan support as more cases of HOA fraud came to light. At Reynolds Family Farm, Tom found himself managing an expanding operation. His veterans program had doubled in size, with new adaptive equipment allowing more disabled soldiers to participate. The barn that once housed his fight against Pierce's HOA now served as a training center for other farmers facing similar threats. We've got requests from 12 different states, Mike reported, reviewing the latest data. Farmers want to learn your documentation methods, your legal strategies. They're calling it the Reynolds Protocol, systematic defense against predatory development. Sarah had expanded her legal team, training attorneys across the country in agricultural property rights defense. The precedents set by Pierce's conviction were being used to fight similar cases nationwide. The FBI's investigation has uncovered 3 more networks like Pierce's, she explained during a strategy session, each one targeting vulnerable farmers using the same forged document tactics. But now we know how to stop them. Frank Miller and other local farmers had transformed their informal resistance into a structured organization. The Farm Protection Coalition now had chapters in 30 states, each equipped with legal resources and emergency response teams for farmers facing HOA threats. Remember when they thought your disability made you an easy target? Frank chuckled. Now every developer in the country thinks twice before messing with a veteran's farm. Tom's father's dog tags caught the morning light as he walked his fields with a new group of veteran students. The adapted equipment that Pierce had tried to seize was now helping dozens of wounded warriors find purpose in agriculture. The Senate Committee's staff had begun drafting additional provisions for the Protection Act, focusing on rehabilitation programs like Tom's. The legislation would provide federal grants for adaptive farming equipment and legal support for veteran-owned agricultural operations. This goes beyond protecting farms, Tom explained to his students. It's about ensuring that those who served have a place to heal, to rebuild, to find new purpose. The sun set over Reynolds Family Farm, casting long shadows across fields that had become a symbol of resistance against corruption. What started as one veteran's stand against illegal seizure had evolved into a movement that was changing the face of American agriculture. Tom stood at his property line, where Pierce's survey stakes had once marked intended destruction. Now, that boundary represented something different, a line where predatory development had met its match in a disabled veteran who refused to back down. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Each new case of HOA fraud was met with organized resistance, each attempted seizure countered by communities that had learned to stand together. Tom's fight had shown them how to win. The Agricultural Communities Protection Act moved swiftly through Congress, carrying with it the stories of hundreds of farmers who'd faced HOA fraud. Tom watched from the Senate gallery as the final vote was tallied, the legislation passing with overwhelming bipartisan support. The new law created immediate protections, criminal penalties for fraudulent HOA claims, federal oversight of development near agricultural land, and special provisions for veteran-owned farms. More importantly, it established a rapid response system for farmers facing equipment seizure threats. Back at Reynolds Family Farm, Tom hosted a gathering of farmers and veterans celebrating the victory. The barn, once a war room for fighting, Pierce's HOA now served as a symbol of successful resistance against corporate fraud. They never understood what they were up against, Sarah remarked, reviewing case files of similar operations being dismantled nationwide. They saw a disabled veteran and thought they found an easy target. Instead, they sparked a revolution in farm protection laws. The FBI's investigation had expanded to 6 states, uncovering networks of corrupt developers using Pierce's tactics. Each case strengthened the precedent set by Tom's victory, making it harder for predatory HOAs to target vulnerable farmers. Mike's documentation of the movement had gone viral, with agricultural communities across the country adopting the Reynolds protocol for defending against development fraud. The system Tom had created now protected thousands of family farms. "Look at what you've built," Frank said, gesturing to the adapted equipment working the fields. "Not just a farm, but a blueprint for fighting back. Every disabled veteran who finds healing here is another victory against what Pierce tried to destroy." Tom's Veterans Program had become a model for similar initiatives nationwide. The Protection Act included funding for adaptive farming equipment, ensuring other disabled veterans could find the same purpose Tom had discovered in agriculture. The key, sunset over fields that had nearly been lost to corruption, but now represented hope for farming communities everywhere. Tom stood at his property line, his father's dog tags catching the evening light, reflecting on how a fight to save one farm had transformed into a movement that protected them all. Sarah brought news of more victories, developers abandoning fraudulent tactics, HOAs restricting their boundaries, and farms being returned to families who'd lost them to schemes like Pierce's. The tide hadn't just turned, it had become a tsunami of reform. "They thought they could steal our equipment," Tom addressed the gathered crowd. "Instead, they gave us the tools to protect every family farm in America. Sometimes the best defense isn't just standing your ground, it's teaching others how to stand with you." The legacy of Tom's fight extended beyond legal victories. It had shown farming communities the power of united resistance, transformed how agricultural land was protected, and created a sanctuary where wounded warriors could rebuild their lives through honest work. As night fell over Reynolds Family Farm, the lights in the barn glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, farmers and veterans shared stories of resistance and recovery, each one a testament to the change that began when one disabled veteran refused to back down. A year after Pierce's conviction, Reynolds Family Farm had transformed into a thriving center for both agricultural innovation and veteran rehabilitation. The HOA's attempted equipment seizure, meant to cripple Tom's operation, had instead catalyzed a nationwide movement for farm protection. "We've got something special to show you," Sarah announced one morning, arriving with a thick folder of documents. "Remember those farms Pierce's operation seized before we stopped them? The federal recovery program is returning them to their original owners." Tom stood in his barn, now expanded to accommodate the growing veterans program, watching as Mike pulled up satellite images on their monitoring system. Each image showed a reclaimed farm, properties rescued from fraudulent development and returned to agricultural use. "The recovery program used your documentation methods," Mike explained, scrolling through the data. "Everything we learned fighting Pierce helped identify which properties were taken through fraud. The FBI's investigation restored over 30 family farms in just this region." Frank Miller arrived with more news from the farming community. The Farm Protection Coalition had successfully prevented 3 attempted HOA land grabs in the past month alone. The Reynolds Protocol had become standard procedure for agricultural communities facing development pressure. "Remember how they thought targeting a disabled vet would be their easiest victory?" Frank chuckled. "Now every HOA in the country thinks twice before trying to mess with a farmer." Tom's veterans program had expanded beyond its original scope. The adaptive equipment that Pierce had tried to seize now served dozens of disabled veterans, each finding their own path to recovery through agriculture. The barn housed state-of-the-art training facilities, funded partly through the Agricultural Communities Protection Act. "This is what they tried to destroy," Tom told a group of new veteran students, gesturing to the adapted machinery. "They saw equipment worth stealing. We saw tools for rebuilding lives." Sarah's legal practice had become a national resource for agricultural communities. The precedent set by Pierce's case had streamlined the process for fighting fraudulent development claims. Farmers no longer faced these battles alone or unprepared. "The landscape has changed completely," Sarah explained during a strategy session. "What used to take years of legal battles can now be stopped in weeks. The Protection Act gave us tools we never had before." As the sun set over his fields, Tom thought about how far they'd come from that morning when he first discovered the HOA's fraudulent seizure notice. His father's dog tags caught the evening light, reminding him of the legacy he'd not only protected but expanded. Mike's monitoring system tracked successful farm defenses across the country, each pin on the map representing a community that had learned to stand together against fraud. The movement that started in Butler County had become a nationwide network of resistance. They never understood what they were really fighting, Tom reflected, watching his veteran students work the adapted equipment. This wasn't just about property or machinery. It was about protecting a way of life that gives people second chances. The Farm Protection Coalition had grown into a powerful advocate for agricultural communities. Regular meetings in Tom's barn, coordinated responses to development threats, shared legal resources, and trained farmers in documentation techniques that could prevent fraudulent claims. As night fell over Reynolds Family Farm, the lights in the training center glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, veterans and farmers worked together, each contributing to a legacy of resistance and recovery that had grown from one disabled veteran's refusal to back down. The battle that began with an illegal attempt to seize farm equipment had evolved into something much larger, a movement that protected not just land and machinery, but the very heart of American agriculture. Tom's fight had shown that sometimes the strongest defense comes not from standing alone, but from teaching others how to stand together. The national impact of Tom's victory continued to grow as the Agricultural Communities Protection Act transformed the landscape of farm defense. One morning, as Tom reviewed updates from the Farm Protection Coalition, a familiar face appeared at his door. Judge Henderson, who had presided over the initial injunction against Pierce's HOA. "Thought you'd want to see this firsthand," the judge said, holding up an official document. "The state Supreme Court just upheld every precedent from your case. They're now binding law across the entire state. The ruling meant that every tactic Pierce's operation had used, from fraudulent HOA claims to equipment seizure attempts, was now explicitly illegal. More importantly, it established fast-track procedures for farmers facing similar threats. We've got 17 states adopting similar standards," Sarah added, spreading maps across Tom's kitchen table. "Your fight didn't just change laws. It changed how the entire legal system approaches these cases." The FBI's investigation had expanded to cover developer networks in multiple states. Each new case reinforced the patterns Tom had first identified, strengthening protections for agricultural communities nationwide. "Look at this," Mike said, pulling up his latest social media analytics. "The Farm Protection Coalition now has active chapters in 42 states. Every time an HOA tries these tactics, they face organized resistance." Tom's Veterans Program had become a model for similar initiatives across the country. The adaptive equipment that Pierce had tried to seize was now being replicated on farms nationwide, helping disabled veterans find purpose through agriculture. "They thought they could shut us down by taking our equipment," Tom told his newest group of veteran students. "Instead, they helped us build something bigger than they could imagine." Frank Miller arrived with news from the local farming community. The techniques they'd developed to fight Pierce's operation had prevented 3 more attempted land grabs in neighboring counties. "Remember when they targeted you because of your disability?" Frank asked, shaking his head. "Now every developer in the state knows. Mess with one farmer, you face all of us." Sarah's legal practice had evolved into a national resource center, training attorneys across the country in agricultural property rights defense. The precedents from Pierce's case had streamlined the process for fighting fraudulent development claims. "We've got a new case in Minnesota," she explained, reviewing files. "HOA tried the same equipment seizure scheme. Thanks to your documentation methods, we shut them down in 48 hours. Tom stood at his property line, where Pierce's survey stakes had once marked intended destruction. Now that boundary represented something different, a line where predatory development had met its match in a disabled veteran who refused to back down. The sun set over Reynolds Family Farm, casting long shadows across fields that had become more than just agricultural land. They were now a symbol of successful resistance against corporate fraud, a blueprint for protecting family farms nationwide. What started here, Tom addressed a gathering of farmers and veterans, wasn't just about saving one farm. It was about showing others how to fight back. Every piece of equipment they tried to steal has helped another veteran heal. Every tactic they used has taught us how to defend ourselves. Mike's monitoring system tracked successful farm defenses across the country, each pin on the map representing a community that had learned to stand together against fraud. The movement that started in Butler County had become a nationwide network of resistance. As night fell over the farm, Tom thought about how far they'd come from that morning when he first discovered the HOA's fraudulent notice. His father's dog tags caught the evening light, reminding him that some battles choose you, that fighting for what's right sometimes means becoming part of something larger than yourself. The legacy of his fight extended beyond legal victories. It had shown farming communities the power of united resistance, transformed how agricultural land was protected, and created sanctuaries where wounded warriors could rebuild their lives through honest work. Tom's Barn, once a war room for fighting. Pierce's HOA now served as a command center for a national movement. The adapted equipment hummed in the background, each piece representing another veteran's journey to recovery, another farmer's stand against fraud. The battle that began with an illegal attempt to seize farm equipment had evolved into something much larger, a movement that protected not just land and machinery, but the very heart of American agriculture. The scope of change sparked by Tom's resistance continued to expand. One morning, as he supervised veteran training in his fields, a delegation from the National Farmers Association arrived at Reynolds Family Farm. "Your fight has become a case. Study in agricultural defense," their spokesman explained. "We want to establish a national training center based on your model, teaching farmers and veterans how to protect their land and rebuild their lives." The proposal would transform Tom's local operation into a nationwide resource. The adaptive equipment that Pierce had tried to seize would become templates for similar programs across the country, helping disabled veterans find purpose through agriculture while teaching farmers how to defend against predatory development. "Look at what they tried to destroy," Sarah remarked, reviewing the expansion plans. "They saw equipment worth stealing. Instead, they helped create a movement that's changing American agriculture." The FBI's ongoing investigation had revealed the full scope of Pierce's network. Similar operations were being dismantled in multiple states, each case strengthening the protections Tom had fought to establish. "Every time we shut down one of these schemes," Mike reported, updating their tracking system, "we find more farmers ready to stand together." The Farm Protection Coalition grew by 30 chapters last month alone. Frank Miller arrived with news from neighboring counties. 3 more HOAs had abandoned attempts to claim jurisdiction over agricultural land, citing the precedents set by Pierce's conviction. "They're learning the hard way," Frank chuckled. "What started as one disabled vet defending his farm has become a nationwide warning. Don't mess with farmers who know how to fight back." Tom's Veterans Program had expanded beyond its original scope. The barn now housed state-of-the-art training facilities, teaching both agricultural skills and legal defense strategies to disabled veterans and farmers alike. "When they tried to seize our equipment," Tom told the gathered delegation, "they never understood what they were really attacking. This isn't just about machinery or land. It's about giving people the tools to defend their way of life." Sarah's legal practice had become a cornerstone of the movement. The documentation methods they'd developed were now standard procedure for farming communities facing development pressure. "We've got requests from 20 states," she explained during a planning session. "Everyone wants to learn the Reynolds Protocol. Your fight showed them it's possible to win these battles." The sun set over fields that had nearly been lost to fraud, but now represented hope for farming communities nationwide. Tom stood at his property line, his father's dog tags catching the evening light, reflecting on how a personal battle had transformed into a movement for change. They thought targeting a disabled veteran would be their easiest victory, Tom addressed the National Farmers Association representatives. Instead, they helped create a network that protects every family farm in America. The legacy of his fight continued to grow. Each piece of adapted equipment, each successful defense against fraudulent claims, each veteran finding healing through agriculture, all traced back to one morning when a disabled veteran refused to let his farm be stolen. As night fell over Reynolds Family Farm, the lights in the training center glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, farmers and veterans worked together, building something stronger than any developer's scheme. A community united in purpose and determined to protect its own. The movement that began with an illegal attempt to seize farm equipment had become something much larger, a blueprint for defending American agriculture against those who would destroy it for profit. "Remember," Tom told his students as they finished their day's training, "every piece of equipment they tried to take has helped another veteran heal. Every tactic they used has taught us how to fight back. Sometimes the best defense isn't just standing your ground, it's teaching others how to stand with you." 2 years after Pierce's conviction, Reynolds Family Farm hosted a national gathering of the Farm Protection Coalition. Farmers and veterans from across the country converged on Tom's property, each bringing stories of successful resistance against predatory development. "Hard to believe it all started with one fraudulent seizure notice," Sarah remarked, watching groups tour the expanded training facilities. "Now look at what we've built, a nationwide network protecting family farms and helping veterans heal." The adaptive equipment that Pierce's HOA had tried to seize now served as the cornerstone of an extensive rehabilitation program. Dozens of disabled veterans worked the fields each day, finding purpose in agriculture while learning to defend against development fraud. "Every machine they wanted to steal," Tom told a group of visiting farmers, "now helps another veteran rebuild their life. Every tactic they used against us has taught hundreds of others how to protect their land." Mike's monitoring system, displayed on screens throughout the barn, tracked successful farm defenses across the country. Each pin on the digital map represented a community that had learned to stand together against fraudulent HOA claims. "We've prevented over 200 attempted seizures this year alone," Mike reported. "The Reynolds Protocol has become standard procedure for agricultural communities facing development pressure." Frank Miller, now heading the regional chapter of the Farm Protection Coalition, brought updates from neighboring states. The movement had transformed how farming communities responded to development threats. "Remember when they thought your disability made you vulnerable?" Frank asked Tom. "Now every developer in the country knows targeting a veteran's farm is asking for nationwide resistance." The FBI's investigation had expanded into its 3rd year, uncovering networks of corrupt developers across multiple states. Each new case reinforced the protections Tom had fought to establish. "What started here," Sarah explained to visiting attorneys, "didn't just change laws, it changed how the entire legal system approaches these cases. The precedents we set protect every family farm in America." Tom stood at the podium in his converted barn, addressing the gathered crowd. His father's dog tags caught the afternoon light as he spoke about the transformation of American agriculture's defense against fraud. "They saw us as easy targets," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled farmers and veterans. "They never understood that by attacking one of us, they'd unite all of us. Every farm they tried to steal has become a fortress of resistance." The National Training Center, built where Pierce had once planned to auction Tom's equipment, now served as a hub for agricultural defense strategies. Farmers learned documentation techniques, while disabled veterans trained on adapted machinery. "Look at what they helped us create," Tom told his newest group of veteran students. "They thought they could shut us down by taking our equipment. Instead, they sparked a movement that's changing American agriculture." As the sun set over Reynolds Family Farm, the gathered crowd witnessed the legacy of one veteran's stand against corruption. Fields that had nearly been lost to fraud now produced hope for farming communities nationwide. The battle that began with an illegal attempt to seize farm equipment had evolved into something much larger, a movement that protected not just land and machinery, but the very heart of American agriculture. "Remember," Tom concluded his address, "every piece of equipment they tried to steal now helps another veteran heal. Every tactic they used has taught us how to fight back. Sometimes the best defense isn't just standing your ground, it's teaching others how to stand with you." The lights in the training center glowed warm against the gathering darkness, illuminating the future of American agriculture's defense against fraud. Inside, farmers and veterans worked together, building something stronger than any developer's scheme, a community united in purpose and determined to protect its own. For Tom, standing at his property line where Pierce's survey stakes had once marked intended destruction, the transformation was complete. What began as one disabled veteran's fight had become a nationwide movement for change, protecting family farms and healing wounded warriors through the power of united resistance. The legacy of Reynolds Family Farm had grown far beyond its boundaries, touching communities across the country and changing how America protected its agricultural heritage. The equipment Pierce had tried to steal now served as tools of transformation, helping others find the same healing and purpose Tom had discovered in farming. 3 years after Pierce's attempted equipment seizure, Reynolds Family Farm hosted a landmark celebration. The Agricultural Communities Protection Act had just marked its first anniversary, and agricultural communities from across the nation gathered to commemorate the transformation their united resistance had achieved. Tom stood at the entrance of his expanded training facility, watching as buses and trucks filled with farmers and veterans arrived. The barn that once housed his battle plans against Pierce's HOA had become the heart of a national movement. "Sometimes I wonder if Pierce knows what she helped create," Sarah mused, standing beside Tom. She thought she could destroy one disabled veteran's farm. Instead, she sparked a revolution in agricultural protection. The adaptive equipment that had been the target of Pierce's fraudulent seizure now filled multiple training bays. Each piece had been replicated and improved, serving disabled veterans across the country while teaching farmers how to defend their land. "Look at these numbers," Mike called out, pointing to the monitoring screens. "Over 500 successful farm defenses this year alone. The Reynolds Protocol has prevented more than $50 million in fraudulent seizures." Frank Miller arrived with a delegation of farmers from neighboring states. Each brought stories of successful resistance, of communities standing together against development pressure. "Remember when they thought targeting a disabled vet would be their easiest victory?" Frank asked the gathered crowd. "Now every HOA in America knows, mess with one farmer, you face all of us." The FBI's investigation had concluded, exposing networks of corrupt developers across 12 states. The prosecution of Pierce's associates had strengthened agricultural protections nationwide. "What started here," Tom addressed the assembly, "wasn't just about saving one farm. It was about showing others how to fight back. Every piece of equipment they tried to steal has helped another veteran heal. Every tactic they used has taught us how to defend ourselves." Sarah's legal practice had evolved into a national resource center, training attorneys in agricultural property rights defense. The precedents from Pierce's case had streamlined the process for fighting fraudulent development claims. "We've changed more than laws," Sarah explained to visiting legal teams. "We've changed how communities respond to these threats. What used to take years of legal battles can now be stopped in days." The National Training Center buzzed with activity as veterans demonstrated adapted farming equipment to visiting groups. Each machine represented another path to recovery, another tool for rebuilding lives through agriculture. "They never understood what they were really attacking," Tom told a group of new veteran students. "This wasn't just about property or machinery. It was about protecting a way of life that gives people second chances." As the sun began to set over Reynolds Family Farm, Tom stood at his property line where Pierce's survey stakes had once marked intended destruction. His father's dog tags caught the evening light, reminding him of the legacy he'd not only protected, but expanded. The battle that began with an illegal attempt to seize farm equipment had evolved into something much larger, a movement that protected not just land and machinery, but the very heart of American agriculture. "Remember," Tom concluded his address to the gathered crowd. Every victory we celebrate today began with one simple choice: the decision to stand together against those who would destroy our way of life. They thought they could isolate us, pick us off one by one. Instead, they united us into something stronger than they could imagine. The lights of the training center glowed warm against the gathering darkness, illuminating the future of American agriculture's defense against fraud. Inside, farmers and veterans worked together, building something stronger than any developer's scheme, a community united in purpose and determined to protect its own. For Tom, the transformation was complete. What began as one disabled veteran's fight had become a nationwide movement for change, protecting family farms and healing wounded warriors through the power of united resistance. The legacy of Reynolds Family Farm would continue to grow, touching communities across the country and changing how America protected its agricultural heritage. The equipment Pierce had tried to steal now served as tools of transformation, helping others find the same healing and purpose Tom had discovered in farming. The final chapter of Reynolds Family Farm's transformation unfolded on a crisp autumn morning, 5 years after Pierce's attempted equipment seizure. Tom stood on his porch, watching the sunrise over fields that had become more than just farmland. They were now a symbol of successful resistance against corruption. "You know what today is?" Sarah asked, joining him with coffee. "Exactly 5 years since they tried to seize your equipment. 5 years since one disabled veteran's stand changed American agriculture forever." The farm had evolved beyond anything Pierce could have imagined when she targeted it. The adaptive equipment she'd tried to steal now filled multiple training facilities, helping disabled veterans find purpose while teaching farmers to defend their land. "Final numbers are in," Mike reported, updating their tracking system. "The Farm Protection Coalition has prevented over 1,000 attempted seizures nationwide. The Reynolds Protocol is now standard defense strategy in 48 states. Frank Miller arrived with news from the State Agricultural Board. Legislation based on the Agricultural Communities Protection Act had been adopted across the country, creating a national shield against predatory development. "Remember when they thought your disability made you an easy target?" Frank chuckled. "Now, your methods are being taught in law schools. Every attorney handling agricultural cases studies." The Pierce conviction, Tom's Veterans Program, had become a model for similar initiatives nationwide. The barn that once housed his battle plans now served as the headquarters for a movement that transformed how America protected its farming heritage. They never understood what they were really fighting, Tom told his newest group of veteran students. This wasn't about equipment or land. It was about protecting a way of life that gives people second chances. Sarah's legal practice had evolved into a national resource center, training attorneys in agricultural property rights defense. The precedents from Pierce's case had streamlined the process for fighting fraudulent development claims. "We didn't just win a legal battle," Sarah reflected. "We created a blueprint for protecting every family farm in America. What started here has saved thousands of farms from fraudulent seizures." The sun climbed higher over Reynolds Family Farm, illuminating fields that had nearly been lost to corruption, but now produced hope for farming communities nationwide. Tom's father's dog tags caught the morning light, reminding him of the legacy he'd not only protected, but expanded. "Sometimes, the best defense isn't just standing your ground," Tom addressed the gathered veterans and farmers. "It's teaching others how to stand with you. Every piece of equipment they tried to steal has helped another veteran heal. Every tactic they used has taught us how to fight back." The National Training Center hummed with activity, each adapted machine representing another path to recovery, another tool for rebuilding lives through agriculture. What Pierce had seen as equipment worth stealing had become instruments of transformation. As the day drew to a close, Tom stood at his property, line where Pierce's survey stakes had once marked intended destruction. The boundary now represented something different, a line where predatory development had met its match in a disabled veteran who refused to back down. The battle that began with an illegal attempt to seize farm equipment had evolved into something much larger, a movement that protected not just land and machinery, but the very heart of American agriculture. For Tom, the transformation was complete. What started as his personal fight had become a nationwide force for change, protecting family farms and healing wounded warriors through the power of united resistance. Reynolds Family Farm would continue to stand as a beacon of hope, its legacy touching communities across the country and changing how America protected its agricultural heritage. The equipment Pierce had tried to steal now served as tools of transformation, helping others find the same healing and purpose Tom had discovered in farming. As night fell over the farm, the lights in the training center glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, farmers and veterans worked together, building something stronger than any developer's scheme, a community united in purpose and determined to protect its own. The story of Reynolds Family Farm had become more than a tale of resistance. It was a testament to the power of standing together against corruption, of finding strength in unity, and of transforming adversity into opportunity. What Pierce had intended as an act of destruction had instead created a legacy of protection, healing, and hope for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.